The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you to our opening webcast, Storage Infrastructure Performance, Building the Foundation for Setting SLAs, featuring research presented by Mark Peters, Senior Analyst for the Enterprise Strategy Group. This is the first of a three-part series called Declouding the Issues, Managing Performance, Complexity, and Cost in the Ever-Evolving Data Center, hosted and moderated by Virtual Instruments. All right, the webcast will include interactive dialogue and Q&A between Mark Peters and John Gentry, CTO for Virtual Instruments. John will moderate the discussion. Sharing a brief intro of our panelists, Mark Peters has 3 decades of data storage industry experience, and his research focuses on all types of storage systems: virtualized storage, solid-state media, software-defined, and converged systems. He has held senior management roles in sales, marketing, product management, business development, and customer intimacy. John Gentry has more than 20 years of IT industry experience, with the majority of his career focusing on IT infrastructure and performance management. He is the voice of the customer for VI and a 2017 recipient of Information Age's Data 50 Award. He's held senior management roles in sales, sales engineering, and marketing. A couple of notes on format. We're anticipating the total run time today, including Q&A from the audience, to be about 40 to 45 minutes, and John Gentry will be the moderator. Also, the webinar will be recorded and distributed for on-demand review for all registered attendees, and we will also be available on the VI website. For questions, please feel free to ask them at any time via the chat panel, and Mark and John will answer at the end. And with that, I'll hand the controls over to Mark and introduce John. All right, Mark, I'm going to go ahead and give you controls now.
I think, John, did you anything to say before we get going?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for setting that up and covering the logistics. And Mark, thank you for joining us on this. I'm excited to sort of moderate this and share some thoughts, primarily from our customer base, about the research that was done for the audience. Just so you're aware, this research was done as a collaboration between ESG and a number of companies, but was really the impetus from customer advisory board sessions that we've been having as a company over the last year plus. We're really looking to validate and expand upon some of what we were hearing directly from individual customers and see if those were, broader industry trends. And I'm looking forward to kind of the compare and contrast as we go through this research. I think, as everyone knows, in terms of declouding the issues, at the heart of every, quote, cloud is ultimately a data center. I've joked that it's actually, there is no cloud, it's just someone else's data center. And it's in constant change, it's complex to manage. And at the core of every data center is, in fact, the storage infrastructure, which we really view as the foundation upon which all the other layers of compute and application capabilities are built. A slight slowdown in the underlying storage infrastructure can translate to significant delays in the application, and even timeouts in web sessions and other calls to that infrastructure. So at this point, this is the first of a 3-part series that is focused on storage strategies and the implications of technologies like cloud and convergence, and will feature sort of trends as researched and determined by ESG, and then some discussion around what we've heard directly from customers and some case studies that I think were relevant to the actual topics. We look forward, going forward, to hear from different subject matter experts on the various topics of data center infrastructure performance. And again, Mark, excited to have you with us today, and thank you very much. We've had a long and valuable relationship with ESG, and I'm looking forward to moderating and participating in this discussion.
All right, John, well, thank you, and welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. Thanks, obviously, to Virtual Instruments for hosting this. And actually, I should say thanks to John, because between the two of us, clearly there's some planning that goes into these things, but we're trying to avoid one of those webinars where it's 20 minutes from me, 20 minutes from him, some Q&A, and we go away. So if it all goes smoothly, you'll notice that this will be not 2 sermons, but hopefully some interaction. and let me get going. I don't want to spend too long on the company commercial from my side, but for anyone who doesn't know ESG, there are some facts and figures on the screen in front of you. An analyst company, research and strategy as well. You can see we're well into the closing out our second decade, and based out of Milford in Massachusetts. Now, the other thing I just want to say, just to not repeat everything that John said, but the way we're going to go through this is obviously some of this is built around the research that John has already mentioned. I'll give initially in the first section just some basic information about what we found out about the storage business in Europe, and then we'll go look at some trends around storage, cloud, convergence, flash, SDS, all those sorts of things, before closing out with obviously what's nearest and dearest to VI and John's hearts, which is the SLAs and how you manage those, particularly around performance and availability. But what we also agreed is after I've gone through each section, I mean, John may well interrupt at any point, but nonetheless, at the end of each little logical section, rather than just doing a commercial for VI and what they have, he will comment on what I have shown by using some actual real case studies and customer examples. So hopefully that'll be more interesting for those of you listening along than just getting, you know, bunches of slides about what VI have. You can always find that out later if you are sufficiently interested. In terms of the research itself, we decided to do some research in Europe because frankly, not much specific storage and infrastructure research is carried out there anymore in terms of end users. So I'm not going to read the whole slide at you. You can see north of 400 people, people who knew what they were talking about. And John has already mentioned that Virtual Instruments was just one of a number of vendors that helped ensure this got done. You can see the countries that we went to. From the vendor perspective, it's worth mentioning that the players that worked with us, the vendors that worked with us, were both big and small. There was even a startup in there. They were everything from massive systems houses down to specialists, some based in Europe and some based in the US. So a really good spread. So the questions weren't there to just represent what VI wanted. Obviously they had their input, but did want to mention that it was a very general piece of research with a very good spread of respondents, as you can see, both by countries and industries. Okay, so let's get into some market basics very briefly here. Storage challenges and spending trends. So, as I say, high-level stuff to get us started. But, you know, I always think it's interesting, some of these questions. We ask people, you know, how important is storage technology to you, to both your IT and your business? And I think it's somewhat reassuring that we still see 50% of the respondents saying that it really is still very strategic. It absolutely should be, shouldn't it? At the end of the day, data is, I know this is cliched, but data is the DNA of business. Everything else in IT is replaceable, as long as you can find the one person who wrote that app from 30 years ago. But, you know, in all seriousness, you can get a new app, you can get a new server, you can't get new data. So treating it very seriously, monitoring, having insights, is clearly very important. Now, what are the IT initiatives that impact spending on storage over the next year or so? Again, I don't intend to go through this whole list. Obviously, you could look at the slides. They could be made available to you after this webinar if you would like to look in more detail. But the takeaway from this is, I think, if you can't tell it from the small font that we've used, but the takeaway is it's a complex world. I'm sure those of you listening can attest to that. You have to manage so much, whether that is everything from, you know, physical things like the cloud, but to interactions with other business, to the increasing expectations of your users, and obviously the straightforward things about speed and reducing costs and so on. So there's a very wide range of applications, initiatives, systems, and expectations of you, which of course means you have a lot of challenges. And again, I'm sure many of you looking at this will go, yeah, I've got all of those. And that's kind of the point. Most people have all of these to some degree. But you can see when we ask people what their main challenges are, no great surprise, to be honest. Data protection. I just said 2 minutes ago how important data is. So clearly protecting it and not losing it is incredibly important. But what's interesting is the basic things. Data growth, costs are always at the top of this chart. But then we now start to notice some really interesting things. Things like management, optimization, and automation are really important. How do you move things around? A lot of the things that you see here require knowledge of what is going on. And that's something that we'll come back to time and time again. But basically, you have a smorgasbord of things that you have to do. Now, not everyone is trying to spend their way out of storage challenges. The sharp people watching this will have noticed that the number of respondents to this question is lower than the 400 that did the overall response. But the reason for that is these are the people who said they were either having flat or decelerating spending on storage. Now, in a storage webinar like this, you might think, well, that's odd to be talking about actually decelerating or flat spending. However, what's really interesting, and the reason we put this, sure, you can see number 2 on the list is people using more cloud, but what's most interesting is clearly spending going down doesn't actually mean capacity is going down or the value of the data is going down. Look at what's top of the chart. Storing data more efficiently. Now, I think I'm always depressed when I am introduced at the beginning and find I've been doing this for 3 decades. However, 3 decades does give you some, obviously some experience and some ability to state things. And I can tell you from the storage side, we've been talking about being more efficient for ages, and I think systems generally have become more efficient. However, you don't see people attesting to it, as they now are here, by saying that is actually a reason that we can manage our costs. So the net of this, I think, fascinating question is that people are managing to spend the same or less by being more efficient with the way they run their data. Doesn't mean to say they're not still growing their capacity. They're not still getting great value from it. But efficiency can drive cost efficiency, or data efficiency can drive cost efficiency as well. So, John, I think you probably have something to say about that and a case study to reflect upon what I've said so far.
I do, and it took all I had to resist interjecting, but you were on such a nice roll. And the thing that I find was interesting about those 3 slides, and certainly the first, which is, storage is still very much strategic to, half of those polled, and even when tactical, still a very important part of the decision making. And you pull that thread through to, what are the things that are impacting storage and causing the challenges, and you look at data growth, and you look at the cost of storage, and you look at the ability to effectively migrate data, which has a direct impact on whether or not you can, in fact, achieve the ability to store data more efficiently, or select a new vendor or a new tier of storage. And those threads to me were all related in kind of how you can not only treat storage as strategic, but make it strategic, and having it be one of the underlying capabilities to drive cost out of IT. And I think, the cost of storage and the growth of storage being number 1 and 2 in that prior slide is, directly tied to this particular case study with Morrison's. Obviously, Morrison's a great company. I'm actually here in the UK and just completed a meeting with the individual who drove this project, no longer with Morrison's, but a great individual. And he was tasked with lowering the total cost of IT supporting the business, very specifically because the retail sector's been under increasing pressure. So I think everyone understands the cost of infrastructure supporting the business is a direct impact on company profitability and margin. And this was very much about getting healthy and driving profit for the business, doing it deep in the data center by driving storage efficiency. And the challenges he had was, how do I do that while continuing to deliver on a business expectation for performance, while migrating to a lower tier of storage that could accomplish several of the goals in terms of driving efficiencies, increasing what I call capacity per floor tile, right? The advent of faster frames and all flash arrays and denser drives and more powerful controllers all equates to I can get more in a single tile. But how do I determine what to put on the floor based on what I have today? How do I manage the kind of before, during, and after expectation set of my customer? And then how do I ensure the success of that project and demonstrate back to the business that I've in fact achieved the levels of utilization and the cost efficiencies that were desired, while not impacting their performance. And as I think anyone who's been through a project like this on the phone knows, the thing that gets blamed for any kind of performance degradation in the business is obviously whatever changed most recently. And so when you enter a massive storage migration and infrastructure optimization project, if that goes poorly, it's going to get blamed for any business impact, whether related or not. And this was a hugely successful project. We were actually able to work together with the team to drive 100% migration from tier 1 expensive spinning disk to a combination of tier 2 with a hybrid backend array capacity, monitor it throughout that migration to ensure zero impact to the business application, and then measure at the end not only the efficiencies gained in terms of cost, but actually this project was then the impetus for establishing the SLAs that maintained consistent performance and could demonstrate that performance back to the business. So, you know, the example here for me was really taking one or two of the key drivers and key challenges from the last 2 slides and exemplifying them in a very specific storage project.
Well, and you raise, I think, a really interesting, or you use a very interesting word. I don't know when it's hyphenated. You still call it a word when it's de-risked? Maybe is that 1.5 words or 2? Anyway, my point being, I think that's something that we overlook in this business all too often. That's really what many people in IT, it's top of their list. Of course, money matters, but de-risking getting to better business outcomes is what everyone is really about. All too often we focus on the technology, and indeed, I'm going to go through some technology stuff now, and you know, a recurring theme in what I say is, you know, there typically aren't panaceas in any given technology. It's also interesting, by the way, I never said this at the beginning, you're over there in the UK somewhere. I sound like I am there. I'm from there, but I'm sitting nearer to the other Manchester over in the US right now. Anyway, all right. So let's look at some of those technologies. I'll try and keep this moving on pretty briskly, because the information I'm going to share with you here is pretty easy to grasp, but nonetheless important for all that. So first off, looking at cloud and convergence. I put those two together. Clearly they're different things, but I think that the similarity is they are both new, different ways to consume IT. Some other things I look at later are a little more either specific or general, but this is about how you consume IT. And I suppose in terms of, I've already mentioned this not being a panacea. This, I think, is a very interesting point. The net of this, to save you digesting everything that's on the chart, is that 91% of the respondents to this survey expect 50% or more of their applications still to be on premises in 5 years' time. So it's incredibly important that we're able to manage both on-premise. Obviously, you want to know what's moving to the cloud, how and when it does so, which clouds, plural. But at the end of the day, there is still a tremendous amount of business that is going to be transacted on-premise. Now, equally, one of the questions we asked, which I think is fascinating, is, so if you have done something in the cloud, have you pulled anything back? A workload or application. And you can see here that 57% of people have pulled something back. Now, it begs a whole load of questions, probably not enough time in this short webinar to go into all those. But it's probably, whatever the reason, you have to assume that some form of SLA, whatever that really referenced, some form of SLA wasn't met. I talked about converged and hyperconvergence. It's another area. Please, when I say it's, you know, don't believe all the hype, I don't mean that it isn't a marvelous technology being increasingly deployed. My point being that if all you read is the, you know, the industry press and people like me, you would think that everyone's running hyperconverged all-flash systems in the cloud and that's it. And the truth is really, as we know, it's not that. Change takes a lot longer to happen. The other thing I want to mention very briefly, because it's important when we talk about controlling a hybrid IT world, before I hand back to John for some comments, is that I think I found people literally saying, yeah, well, we've got something in the cloud and we've got something on premise, so we're hybrid. I would say, no, not really. You've just got some of each. That's not hybrid. Hybrid is integrating the two. If you just have some of each, that would be a bit like having a Tesla and some big gas guzzling truck in your garage and saying, I've got two hybrid vehicles. No, you've got one of each. And I think that's just something that gets overlooked. But here we've got the summary of this little section, passing back to John now, is a lot is still going to be on-prem. Some has come back from the cloud, and converged and hyperconvergence hasn't quite taken over the world just yet. I think you said, John, I'll move the slide forward. I think you said you got a really good example to talk about here.
Yeah, I do. And I really appreciate the distinction there between what is, two independent environments and what is a truly hybrid environment. I've been having a lot of conversations this week about not just hybrid data center, but probably more importantly, hybrid applications or hybrid combinations where part of it's running in a cloud, part of it's running on-prem, and seeing both is critical. And, when we talk about convergence, the primary use case is building a private cloud as an alternative to public cloud, and it's not panacea. I'm seeing some very specific, very effective projects where they've defined a use case, and hyperconverged makes an incredible amount of sense, be it to achieve agility or consistency in cost to support specific growth and workload. But as a general compute solution, not seeing that the breadth of adoption that maybe the providers there would like to push forward. From a cloud perspective, this is an interesting trend and something that I think many anticipated, but I'm talking about pulling workloads back from the cloud. This customer is actually a publicly referenceable customer of ours that just requested that we not share their name associated with this particular project because it was a bit of a challenge for many people. They did the classic cloud-first strategy and enabled their DevOps teams and line of businesses to spin up workloads in the cloud, and very quickly realized that they had workloads running in 4 distinct cloud providers, multiple instances in each of those. The cost advantages that had originally been espoused were actually the inverse of what was realized as true as the bills continued to roll in, and that they had lost all sense of governance over the process of requesting, spinning up, and delivering infrastructure resources to the business. And so they've had a substantial pullback where they realized, this actually needs to be governed by IT ops, and we need to pull together a tiger team of experts that can work cross-functionally to deliver a cloud-like infrastructure that has a link to the public cloud for what really is the only pure driver for them, which is the elasticity or burstability associated with certain seasonality in their business. So this is one that I think we're going to see more and more of, which is we experimented during the hype. We actually ended up with too much out there. We're pulling some, if not all, back. We're refining the cloud strategy to have a provider or two of choice, and then we're putting governance of access to that back in the hands of IT, where, hey, 20, 30 years of process and governance isn't just tossed out the window because of the promise of cloud.
No, sorry, I was just wanted to comment on something where you've got that cloud-first strategy. We hear that a lot, and I don't have this particular piece of research with me today, but what I would say is we do notice that, I can remember what it is, it's 4 out of 5, 80% of people at least consider the cloud to some degree. They may have this, quote, cloud-first, unquote, strategy, or they may, compare the best approach. But I think the takeaway from that is people are thinking about this. That doesn't mean to say they then have to do it. And we already seen, both from what I said, from the research, which validates what you've seen from this actual customer, that some people pretty quickly figure out that it's not quite as straightforward as they imagine. And by the way, just while we're on it, you mentioned right up front, John, you had some question marks over, let's say, the definition of the public cloud. I can't remember exactly what you said, but I think that's really interesting. I often say to people, just to get the conversation started, I mean, there really isn't a public cloud. By definition, there isn't one. There are lots of individual clouds that we can use, some private, some public. The case for every individual user is to figure what works best for them. We just happen to have more tools. And you said, I think what you did say is, look, it's just someone else's data center. Couldn't agree more. What is the best data center mix to use for what applications, to de-risk them and get the best results? I mean, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, and the promise of cost savings is quickly becoming, the lesser of the drivers from, agility and elasticity being primary, because it's not necessarily cheap.
Yeah, I've heard someone once said that we live in a post-performance world. Maybe we live in a post-capacity world. Now, I don't think either of them are true, but the point was, you can get capacity and performance. When you and I entered this business, even though you're clearly a youngster, but when you and I entered this business, you really had to wait for the next level of performance or capacity because you absolutely needed it. That really isn't true now. You can go get what you need. The question is, what is optimum for you? Which is a great segue. We didn't even plan this one. One of the things that we see a lot of, obviously, is the adoption, the increase of availability of solid-state storage, typically all flash arrays or flash built into something else. And clearly, if performance and SLA is a challenge, this is one way that people talk about getting answers. I'll cover this one really quickly, John, because I think it's very straightforward. Number one, flash is just a media. It's one form of solid state. There are others. It's the endemic one right now, but it's just a media. It's not really a market or a way of doing things. And again, this may surprise some people, I think. It's not quite as universally adopted as you might think. As you can see here, you've got 45% of respondents saying they do use it already, with another 24 saying they're going to get there in the next year. Now, of course, that's a big chunk. It's 2/3 of people. But, I think it would be easy to misassume from just reading the press that, everyone's already using all flash arrays. And why isn't that the case? Well, I think one of the clues is in this chart. It's the simple fact that users know, I'm going to assume people listening to this webinar, they know. Now, this question is it's important to see what it's talking about. It's talking about which applications, if you like, demand the performance of solid state. There are other reasons to buy solid state, don't get me wrong. It's very quiet, it's very small, it's becoming more cost effective. It's still maybe not really there yet unless you do some other things to make it so. But at the end of the day, you can see the net of this is that for most people, they don't see the majority of their applications requiring the performance of solid state. So that's one of the things that slows things down. By the way, just one quick thing, and then John, back to you again. I just want to say this. I'm not sure how pertinent it is to the topic here, but obviously NVMe is next. We don't need to get into that, but that's another thing that will be a frenzy. Great technology, wonderful thing, but at the end of the day, it's a media, even though NVMe is really a protocol, but it's nonetheless attached with solid state. It's really just a way to adjust and use the media better. We're going to see another frenzy around that, but again, what really matters is what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and the frenzy, certainly, I won't get into NVMe. We'll maybe have a follow-up to this series on that. It is a very exciting transition in the overall command set, but not necessarily as revolutionary as the world might hope. In terms of Flash for All, there's certainly a lot of marketing dollars. I'd say there's probably as much marketing dollars being spent as there is actual dollars on storage being spent to hype the Flash for All. But one of the things that prior chart clearly showed was intelligent users know that probably 70% of the users know that 30% of their workload actually requires Flash. And in this particular case, this was specifically the project. We had a major refresh, a number of storage vendors trying to tout our latest all-flash arrays as being the end-all be-all, not just for specific workloads, but for the overall infrastructure. And in this case, they were able to not only capture workload and run a test and simulation against the various vendors to determine which vendor offered the most suitable performance for the actual workload of their applications, but they were able to sort of deflate the hype from a couple of business units that were demanding all flash, but really their application didn't have the level of performance required. In one case, they could spend incrementally almost 2x on an all flash array, but they were able to demonstrate that that would only deliver a 1% improvement in the performance of the application. And it was a real win for that team because they were able to not only improve the performance and select the right vendor, they were able to select the right vendor for the right workload and actually save the company money in applications that didn't require flash. And I think, to your point, there are other benefits to flash, density, power cooling, certainly all play in the mix. But I think from my perspective, it's about data-driven decision-making and intelligence in how you choose not just the media, but the vendor, the configuration, and ultimately the workload that's most suited to it. The joke I like to say is flash doesn't necessarily solve all performance problems. Some cases it simply gets you to the scene of the accident faster.
No, you said that the other day. I thought that was very good. Let me do one last section on technology, John, and then we'll get to the part that I know you will have most to talk about in terms of, so what are we going to do about all this? I just want to very briefly touch on next generation storage architectures, by which I really mean, as much as anything else, software-defined storage. I mean, that's one of the key ones, and certainly there are others, which I'll mention in a second, but that's the one I want to talk about. What I would say is that in terms of next generation, SDS really is next. And what do I mean by that? Well, on the one hand, it is, because it exists today. As you can see, there are 18% of people saying they're already moving in that direction. What I think is very interesting about this chart, though, is the fact how many people are seriously, in the case of the yellow part there, either committed to it or the green part, conceptually interested. Not quite there yet, but you start adding up all these sections and you can see that the impetus, the interest and the impetus behind software defined is really key. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that, to coin a phrase, storage itself will ultimately become more of an application than an occupation. And guess what? Because we're moving towards the end of the session here, but that increasingly ties you to a need for insight and management. Now, I said there are other things milling around in the future. I guess if we sum all these up, you've got convergence going on. Obviously, we talked about cloud. I've just mentioned software defined. You can see that software defined shows up as a smaller section in terms of what's most likely to impact the next 5 years. But that was because we asked people to pick the number one. These three things, convergence, cloud, and software, clearly are not mutually exclusive. And again, everything John and I have been saying is about picking the right tools, the right set of tools for what you're trying to do. None of these technologies we've looked at are themselves panaceas, and they all favor or require management to make them worse. Now, we're going to get on to the final section, but John, yeah, did you... Well, you didn't have a case study here, but what did you want to say?
I didn't because, frankly, the numbers bear out why I didn't. We don't have, as much experience or case studies documented of, successes with software defined. In fact, I've got a customer that's deployed a significant footprint of software defined on the promise of, ease of use, agility, lower cost. And the fact is they can't actually get the business application owners to migrate to it because they can't demonstrate a measurable performance-based SLA. And they're coming to us with some requests to support that environment and help with that. But to your point, a lot of exploration, a lot of variation, some of the more proprietary aspects of infrastructure that I think we all tried to get away from through the advent of standards are kind of re-emerging when you look at software defined. So while very exciting, I think still has some maturation and evolution to go before it gets really mainstream for the mission critical workloads of the customers out there.
Right. Well, as everyone listening would expect, there's presumably something we can do about it. I know John has a couple of great commercial examples, not commercials necessarily for VI directly, but examples of real world applicability to share with you after this section. But I just want to pretty rapidly, and John, if you just let me get through these, because there's half a dozen slides, but they're really easy to take in. Before we get to letting John share those with you, obviously, again, we did this research. It wasn't just for VI, it was for a number of companies. That really does bear repeating at this point. So before we start asserting value, let's talk about what users are looking for and thinking about storage performance and availability, SLAs, right now. Half a dozen slides or so. I'll go through these really quite quickly to leave John plenty of time. But do application owners require visibility into health and performance of storage? Most say yes, as you can see, the majority. That's perhaps not surprising. How will organizations ensure performance and availability requirements in their next on-premises storage system purchase? And you can see here that you can read the answers and the balance for yourselves, but most people want something other than directly just from the vendor that they bought their storage system from, so that's important. How are they going to ensure performance and availability? Again, vendor agnosticism comes through. Not to say that proprietary monitoring tools don't have their place, but nonetheless, you see this beginning of a trend or a theme that I'm trying to put forward here. In terms of what's used on site, people want real time as opposed to non-real time. That, again, I suppose, would be something that you might expect. And by the way, although I don't have this chart here, as we talk about the information that people want to use for this insight and analytics, it's also interesting. Another piece of research we've done shows that in general, if people look at the hiring they're planning to do over the next few years, for the first time, we're seeing people attesting to getting more generalists than specialists. And again, as you get more generalists, that again favors needing insight and management because they won't have that specialist capability that is so important. I'm going to let John talk about all this in just a second, but how do application owners feel? Most of them want to have an engagement, some level of interaction in terms of what gets done about data storage. It's clearly important. We've talked myriad times as we've gone through this about business outcomes and getting the best things done. And so, of course, you're going to want to have this interaction. As we talk more about IT as a unit of delivery, rather than of 3 or 4 different parts. And by that, I mean applications and infrastructure and management and so on. These things have to come together if you're going to improve what you actually deliver to the business. Who actually establishes SLAs? Again, you can read through this both now and later, but most people are establishing either performance, availability, or both when it comes to their SLAs. And of course, the determination of whether it will be one, other, or both will very much be a function of the application or the business that someone finds themselves in. But clearly, SLAs are desirous and are established. And the last one I want to just talk about here is the fact that there are amazingly still some people who don't. So if there's nothing else that comes out of this discussion, I'm hoping that some of you will think about putting SLAs in place. But I know you've got a couple of great examples to take us through, John. The last thing I just want to say in wrapping from me, because unless there's Q&A or until there's Q&A, I'll try and keep out of your way, John, is the summary is of everything I've put forward in this last section. Again, to use something of a cliche, but you can't manage what you can't measure, and you need to measure it you need to measure it better in order to manage it better. Pretty obvious, but nonetheless, obviously desired, but not yet done by everyone. John, your turn.
Yeah, thank you, and we'll get into the case study. Some very interesting findings. I thought the fact that they want a third-party trusted advisor in most cases to help. In many of those cases, the one question that was missing there was what data do you use to drive those decisions, whether you're giving the data to your storage vendor, a third-party integrator, or VAR, or you're leveraging tooling to do so. And in terms of using vendor-provided solutions versus vendor-agnostic solutions, I think a large percent of that they've got multiple vendor tools, and so they are using vendor-provided tools. But not just one to manage all, right? It's very much device and vendor specific. And that's really where the challenge comes in for managing an SLA, where an application may span multiple generations of storage, maybe even multiple vendors, or be migrating between the two, and expectations are different. And I think a big play into whether you're providing an SLA on availability or an SLA on performance is what's the tier of the application and what's the requirement, right? So maybe it's tier 0 gets performance SLA and tier 1 gets an availability SLA. And That would make, you know, the tier 1 a clear candidate for cloud, where tier 0 clearly not, right? And Sprint was facing all of these challenges in terms of, you know, multi-vendor estate, growing incredibly rapidly, driving to virtualize everything, trying to drive higher and higher levels of utilization, ensure they could dynamically scale, support the business. And they were unique in that they had, you know, technologies from multiple server vendors, multiple storage vendors, virtualization across hosts, network, and storage. And they had no choice in their desire to deliver an SLA, but to find a vendor agnostic, vendor independent solution that wasn't just vendor independent, but generationally independent. So whether it was, you know, the latest VMAX or a legacy, you know, IBM Shark, they could get consistent metrics from the both. And, you know, Josh Morton, a great individual out there, runs infrastructure services for them. And you know, he determined that to hit his goals, which were very specifically, you know, driven by level of utilization and level of performance, he had to have something that spanned across all of the vendors in his environment and gave him sort of that single source of truth for not only managing the vendors, but representing back to the business that he was achieving the levels of virtualization that would drive the cost improvement, drive the price performance ratios, and meet the performance SLAs. And this was a phenomenal project that continues to be ongoing. You know, when we started working with them, they were in the single digit petabyte range. They're now in the, you know, multiple tens of petabytes, and they're managing that environment with the same team, which is something they were also driven to do, which is how do we manage growth while having static employee resource or headcount. And when you look at, you know, probably the most stringent business user and someone who absolutely aligns and drives what they would consider competitive advantage through the use of performance SLAs, you have to look at kind of the closing case study here, which is E-Trade. And as you can imagine, E-Trade, their business is the performance of their application. They have that one killer app that is trading, and you know, they can't execute a trade until the write is committed on the back end array. And the faster they can commit those rights and the more consistently they can guarantee that, the better they can drive their business. And they had two unique aspects of their use case. One, obviously delivering, you know, sub 0.5 millisecond SLAs on write commits. At the time that they did it was sort of, you know, at a time when that was unheard of. It's getting more and more common, but it's not just the drive or disk measurement. Most people, when they say I'm getting 0.5 milliseconds or sub 5 milliseconds, they're talking about the time that write spends inside the array. In this particular case, they're talking about from the time that write leaves the host adapter, traverses the network, gets committed, and the confirmed response comes back. So very different ability to achieve those levels of service. But what they also have done is actually been able to enhance their product development and the agility of their product development and release cycle. They've introduced measurement and testing so that they're actually using the metrics they use to deliver on their SLA to also guide how their coders package I/O for that backend system. So they're actually accelerating the dev and release cycle and ensuring ongoing consistent performance by influencing the coding and the packaging of I/O with the data they have about what delivers the fastest response times from their particular infrastructure provider. And by doing that, they've actually seen, you know, 10x growth at 3x the growth in infrastructure. So true competitive advantage where they started aggressive, but they really transformed the way they go about the relationship between the business, the application owners, and the backend storage teams.
And you know, John, I'm going to hand it back to Matt in just a second to run the Q&A and then close us out. But I just want to make one closing comment here. I think both examples are really interesting. The E-Trade one, because as you say, SLAs as competitive advantage is not a term that people would usually think of using, but it's absolutely, as you've shown here, absolutely possible. But also the Sprint example was interesting. You talked about performance, utilization, and cost. I want to change one word in that, just not to cheat, you'll see what I'm going to say. But if you said performance, capacity, and cost, because really it's kind of the same thing. So often in IT, people say, yeah, that's great. I want all those three, but pick two. And so again, whether it's SLAs used, I would say, in a sort of not vanilla, but in to address some fairly standard challenges of storage that we saw earlier, or here for SLAs being used for something really quite advanced. Either way, if you know what you're doing, again, if you can measure and manage and get insights, then things are really improved. So with that, Matt, I cede the microphone to you.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, John. So we do have a couple of questions, and let me pull them up real quick. Let's see. Okay, first question is, let's see, you mentioned cloud pullback. Why do you think this is happening? Is this just for business critical apps? Do you see this increasing over time?
So I'll jump in.
Shall I have a go? Or okay, John, yeah, you go first.
I was just from that particular case study. I say there's a cloud first and last strategy. So it's cloud first, but it's the last place you put your mission critical app. So in that case, it wasn't about they did not move their mission critical apps to cloud. It was really the cloud sprawl and the misconception of the cost and efficiencies they would gain, and the need to reassess. They still have very much a cloud aggressive cloud strategy. It's just rethinking sort of how they go about governing and making those choices.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think there are multiple potential reasons. I will tell you, actually, it's fascinating. The answer to that question, and we got similar response for the US market when we did similar research there, has inspired us to go do some more research. I think the expectations are, again, I said earlier, some sort of SLA isn't being met. Now, is that performance? Is it response time? Is it cost, obviously? There are all those. And I think also there are some people who are actually using the cloud as a test bed for operations with every intent of moving something back. So we shouldn't assume everything is negative. Again, everything is about trying to figure out the optimum way to do it. Is it just business critical applications? No, I'm sure it's a mix depending on the organization, because whilst business critical apps are the most logical ones where an SLA might fail, but we're also seeing an increasing interest by users in putting production / business critical apps into the cloud, because business criticality means different things to different people. So again, if there's one takeaway from this conversation, it's always trying to find the optimum way to do the optimum things for your business, and there is no single panacea for that other than knowing what the heck you're dealing with.
Okay, we have another question. This says, you mentioned the use of real-time versus non-real-time monitoring. Is there a standard definition to this, as it seems every monitoring vendor claims real-time?
That's got the word vendor in it, John, so you can take that one.
Yeah, but being the vendor, that I'm inherently lacking in credibility there. But from my perspective, real-time is about the granularity of measurement and the rapidness or speed to which decisions or outcomes can be reached. And so, from a granularity of measurement, real time is collecting data all the time, not polling every 5 minutes or looking at an average, but actually seeing the true response time of every single IO as it's happening. And so that's always been, our definition of real time. And in terms of real time from a management perspective, it's, is the system continually correlating and analyzing that data to produce recommendations or alerts or actions that are happening, faster than the pace of typical human decision making around, observe, decipher, investigate, and then act. It's getting to the act part much, much faster.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, we have another question. Let's see this question. It looks like not everyone has moved to solid state. Is this just a matter of cost divided by gigabyte, or are AFAs overkill for most apps?
All right, John, I'll take this one. Obviously, someone was paying attention, because yes, that is indeed what the research says. Cost is part of it. Let's be fair. The big disk manufacturers are not, they've got lots of PhDs trying to make disks more attractive, price-wise, performance-wise, and so on. So it's not that there is genuinely a crossover. Every all-flash array vendor will tell you that they're now cheaper than disk, but that has immediate caveats for performance applications. So when it comes to high critical applications, yes, you can make a cost case. You saw in the data that there is a chunk of people for whom they do, a chunk of applications that do require the sort of performance that solid state and all-flash arrays can produce, but it's not everything. Both John and I mentioned there are other reasons to buy solid state all-flash arrays, everything to do with reliability, to do with size, and so on and so forth. And those are important too. But again, I think most people, and it takes time for things to change in IT, just, you know, buying cycles, if nothing else. But I think the fact that we haven't made a more wholesale move, albeit all-flash arrays are, you know, the traction is growing fast. The reason we haven't made a wholesale move is that users are smart enough to sit back and again say, what actually do they need for what given application?
Yeah, and in what adoption schedule, right? I think you will see increasing percentages as assets get aged off the floor, and that certainly has an economic implication there too.
Sure.
Okay, it looks like we have time for one more question. Let's see, this question is, you mentioned the term application-centric. How can I show key performance data and what that's meaningful to my application owners?
Do you want to, John, you want to close out? It's your webinar, so I feel you should have the last word.
I certainly can, and you know, this is another one that's kind of like real time in terms of has a lot of different definitions and seems to be on the hype cycle of getting overused more and more. From our perspective, application-centric is the ability to present what's happening in an infrastructure level in the context of the application. So, you know, this is something that, you know, has been critical, certainly being highlighted by the rise of organizations like AppDynamics and certainly the increased attention on performance management as a general category across both apps and infrastructure. But really it's driven also by cloud, in that, you know, the business owners and the application owners aren't looking at cloud and saying, I'm going to buy my storage from cloud or my compute from cloud. They're saying, I'm going to buy infrastructure as a service to support my app. And so they think of cloud in the context of their app. And if we want to be competitive as internal IT, we have to start thinking about the infrastructure that we deploy as a holistic stack in the context of the application. So what's the compute, network, storage, resources required to support an application or business function? And how can we start talking about the service levels we're delivering and the performance and availability and health of that environment in language that, you know, ultimately the customer or that application owner or the business understands and can associate with? Because if they think about the cloud as you know, being associated with their app, and they think about infrastructure as being a bunch of storage and compute that everybody uses, well, that's a losing proposition for the on-prem estate. And so, you know, from my perspective, it's this general shift in market to starting to think about infrastructure in the context of the application and having, you know, more acute conversations with our buyers and our customers about how that infrastructure holistically is supporting that app, and the information can be presented in the context of that app. And to me, that is app-centric. And with that, Matt, thank you for facilitating. Mark, thank you again for doing and providing the summary of the research. It was some great research, showed some things we expected, some things that frankly were a bit surprising, but really appreciate your time today and look forward to future sessions in this series and in others. But thanks for your partnership, and have a great day. And everyone on the line, thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in our next of the series.
Thank you. This concludes today's webinar. If you have any questions related to Mark's research, please feel free to email Mark at mark.peters@esgglobal.com. And if you have any questions related to virtual instruments, please email information@virtualinstruments.com. Today's webinar was recorded. We will be sending out a link to view the replay within the next day. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for attending today. This concludes the presentation.